They had planned for maybe a dozen dogs to show up that morning, tails wagging, tongues out, happy to see anyone with a treat in their pocket. Nobody had planned for what happened when the nurse walked into the room. 5 military working dogs, retired, decorated, each one trained for years to obey a single handler and no one else, broke formation at the exact same moment, not one at a time, not in sequence, all 5 together, as if some invisible signal had passed between them that no human in that room could hear. They didn't run toward the treats. They didn't run toward their handlers. They ran to her, a nurse nobody at that hospital had ever thought twice about. A woman who ate lunch alone, who left before anyone could ask her to stay, who had worked in that building for 3 years, without a single person learning anything real about where she'd come from. By the end of that day, 5 different military handlers would be standing in a hospital hallway, staring at a woman they had never met, asking the same impossible question: how does she know my dog? The answer had been sitting quietly inside her for 14 years. And she had never planned on telling anyone. The Fort Belwood Regional Medical Center sat on the edge of a sprawling army base in central Texas, the kind of hospital that served soldiers, veterans, and military families in roughly equal measure. A building that had seen more grief and more quiet miracles than most people could imagine in a lifetime. Clare Dunmore had worked there for 3 years, in the general medical wing, mostly caring for veterans recovering from surgeries, infections, the slow, unglamorous business of aging bodies that had given decades of service to something larger than themselves. She was good at her job, better than good. The kind of nurse other nurses quietly admired without quite being able to explain why. She never seemed rushed, never seemed rattled, even when a patient was frightened or in pain or simply lonely in the particular way that hospital rooms make people lonely. She had a stillness to her that put people at ease, but she was, by every account anyone at that hospital could give, a mystery. She didn't talk about her past. When new co-workers asked the ordinary getting-to-know-you questions, "Where are you from?" "How long have you been a nurse? Do you have family nearby?" She answered briefly, pleasantly, and somehow the conversation always moved on before anyone realized they hadn't actually learned anything. She wore her hair pulled back in the same simple way every day. She kept a small framed photograph on her desk that nobody had ever gotten a clear look at, angled slightly away from the door. She ate lunch alone in the break room, usually with a book, and left promptly at the end of her shift without lingering the way most of the staff did. "She's not unfriendly," one of the younger nurses, a woman named Patrice, had said once, trying to explain her to a new hire. "She's just closed, like there's a door somewhere in her that doesn't open." Nobody pushed. In a place like Fort Belwood, everybody understood on some level that people carried things. You learned not to pry. What none of them knew, what Clare had spent 14 years making sure nobody knew, was that she hadn't always been a general medical nurse in a quiet Texas hospital. 14 years earlier, under a different name, in a different uniform, she had been a combat medic and field surgical nurse, attached to a forward operating base in a war zone most of her current co-workers had only read about in headlines, and during those 2 brutal, formative years, she had done something that very few people in her current life would ever guess. She had spent countless nights treating the military working dogs who came back from patrols wounded, exhausted, and sometimes unbearably without their handlers. The hospital had organized a community outreach day, a canine retirement and adoption showcase held in the hospital's largest event hall, a partnership between the base's military working dog program and a non-profit that helped place retired service dogs with veteran families. It was meant to be a heartwarming, low-key afternoon. Local news was sending a small crew. A few dozen retired dogs, most now living at a nearby canine sanctuary, were being brought in so families could meet them. And so the base could honor their service with a small ceremony. Claire hadn't planned on attending. It wasn't her department, wasn't her patient population, and if she was honest with herself, hospital events with dogs in them were exactly the kind of thing she quietly avoided, for reasons she never explained to anyone. But her floor was short-staffed that day, and the event hall needed medical coverage in case any of the elderly veterans attending had an incident, a fall, a dizzy spell, the ordinary risks of packing a lot of frail people into a warm, crowded room. Claire's supervisor asked her to cover it as a favor, and Claire, who rarely said no to anything, asked of her directly. Agreed. She arrived a few minutes into the event, dressed in her scrubs, carrying a small first aid kit, and took up a quiet position near the back wall, the way she always positioned herself in crowded rooms. Close enough to see everything, far enough to not be seen. The event hall was full of noise and motion, families crouched to greet dogs. A local news reporter interviewed a handler about a Belgian Malinois decorated service record. Somewhere near the front, a base chaplain was preparing to say a few words about sacrifice and loyalty before the formal part of the program began. And near the center of the room, held on individual leads by their current caretakers, sat 5 retired military working dogs, waiting for their moment in the ceremony. A German shepherd with a gray-flecked muzzle named Duke, a lean, dark-eyed Malinois named Ranger, a stocky, scarred Dutch shepherd named Coach, a smaller, older female shepherd named Nova, and a massive, silver-muzzled shepherd named Atlas, easily the oldest of the group. None of them knew Claire was in the room, or so everyone assumed. 15 minutes into the event, Duke lifted his head. It happened quietly enough that almost nobody noticed. A shift in posture, ears swiveling, nose working the air. His handler, a young volunteer from the sanctuary named Ben, gave the leash a small, automatic correction, assuming the old dog had simply caught the scent of food somewhere in the crowd. Duke didn't settle. He stood, slowly, stiffly, the way older dogs stand when their joints protest the effort, and turned his body fully toward the back of the room, toward the wall where the medical staff had been asked to wait, toward Claire. "Duke," Ben said, low and firm. "Sit." Duke did not sit. For the first time in the 18 months Ben had worked with him, Duke ignored a direct, well-trained command entirely, and began walking, not lunging, not pulling, just walking, calm and utterly certain, toward the back wall. A few people nearby noticed and smiled, the way people smile at any dog, behaving with unexpected purpose at an event built around dogs. "Oh, look at him go." Someone assumed he'd spotted a treat. Someone else assumed he simply wanted attention. Nobody understood what was actually happening until Duke reached Claire, sat down in front of her without being asked, and pressed the entire weight of his graying head against her leg with a kind of urgency that had nothing to do with treats or attention at all. Claire went very still. She looked down at the dog. Something crossed her face, brief, involuntary, the kind of expression a person makes when a memory arrives faster than they can prepare for it. "Hi," she said quietly, so quietly that only Ben, hurrying over, and Duke himself could hear it. "Hi, sweetheart." "I know." Ben stopped a few feet away, confused. "I'm so sorry. He's never done that before. He doesn't usually leave a handler's side without a command." "It's all right," Claire said, crouching down slowly, resting one hand gently against the side of Duke's face in a gesture that looked, to anyone watching closely, less like a stranger meeting a friendly dog and more like a reunion. Nobody was watching closely yet, but that was about to change. 2 minutes later, Ranger's ears went up. The Malinois had been sitting calmly beside his handler near the front of the room, waiting for his turn in the small ceremony, when his whole body seemed to shift focus at once. Head lifted, nose working, eyes fixed on the same spot at the back wall where Duke now sat, pressed against a nurse's leg. His handler, a base K9 trainer named Staff Sergeant Marissa Cole, felt the change in the leash before she consciously registered it. "Easy," she murmured, glancing down. "What's got into you?" Ranger did not settle either. He rose and, like Duke before him, walked with that same eerie, focused calm, weaving carefully between families and folding chairs, directly toward the back wall. By now, a few more people had noticed. The chaplain paused mid-sentence at the podium, glancing toward the small commotion. The local news camera operator, sensing something unplanned and interesting, swung his lens toward the back of the room. Ranger reached Clare and sat, exactly as Duke had, at her feet. Marissa Cole followed, her expression somewhere between professional concern and genuine bewilderment. She had handled Ranger for 2 years. In that time, she had never once seen him break formation for a stranger. "Ma'am," she said carefully. "Do you know this dog?" Clare looked down at Ranger, who was now leaning his full weight against her other leg, exactly the way Duke had, exactly the way a dog leans against someone it trusts completely. "I think I might," Clare said quietly. "It's been a long time. How long?" Clare hesitated. The question sat in the air a beat too long, long enough for Marissa to understand that whatever answer was coming, it would not be a simple one. 14 years, Clare said finally, give or take. Marissa's eyebrows rose. Ranger was only 9 years old. That doesn't. She started, then stopped, because in that moment, a third dog rose from its position near the front of the room, unbidden, and began the same slow, deliberate walk toward the back wall. By the time Coach and Nova had also broken formation, both moving with that same calm, unhurried certainty, both settling at Clare's feet without any command or encouragement. The entire event hall had gone quiet. The chaplain had stopped speaking entirely. The reporter's camera was rolling, fully focused now on the back wall, where 4 retired military working dogs sat pressed around a single nurse who had until 15 minutes earlier been a woman nobody in that room could have picked out of a crowd. 4 different handlers stood nearby now, 4 sets of eyes fixed on Clare, with a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and something like awe. "This isn't normal," Marissa Cole said, mostly to herself. "This is not. Dogs don't do this. Not like this. Not all of them, not at once, not for a stranger." "She's not a stranger," Ben said slowly, watching Clare's face. "Look at her. She's not confused. She's not scared. She looks like..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in that section of the room was thinking the same thing, watching the same thing. A woman who had clearly, unmistakably, met these dogs before. Clare remained crouched in the middle of 4 dogs, one hand resting on Duke's head, another on Nova's back, her expression somewhere between overwhelmed and finally, quietly, relieved. The particular look of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time and has just run out of room to keep holding it. "I need to explain something," she said, mostly to Marissa, though her voice had begun to carry further than she intended, the room having gone still enough to hear her. "But it's not a short story. We have time," Marissa said. "I think everyone here would like to hear it." Before Clare could answer, the 5th and largest dog, Atlas, the oldest and most decorated of the group, a massive silver-muzzled shepherd, who had remained still and watchful through the entire scene, sitting rigid beside his own handler near the front, finally rose. He didn't walk the way the others had. He moved slower, more deliberately, each stride carrying the visible weight of an old body that had given everything it had over a long career. But his direction was exactly the same. When he reached Clare, he didn't simply sit at her feet the way the others had. He pressed his entire body against her, nearly knocking her off balance, and made a low, broken sound that every handler in that room recognized immediately, because it was a sound working dogs almost never made in public. Not a bark, not a whine grief. Clare wrapped both arms around Atlas's neck and pressed her face into his fur. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, everyone watching understood, without needing a single word of explanation yet, that this was not simply a strange coincidence. This was a reckoning 14 years in the making. Colonel Nathan Reyes, the base's senior veterinary officer, had been standing near the podium when the first dog broke formation, and by the time the fifth one reached the back wall, he had made his way through the crowd, cutting a direct line toward the small, extraordinary scene now unfolding in front of half the hospital staff and a rolling news camera. He was 61 years old, had spent the better part of 4 decades working with military working dogs in one capacity or another, and had, in that time, developed a very reliable instinct for knowing when something happening in front of him mattered. This mattered. "Ma'am," he said gently, crouching down to Claire's level, the way you'd approach someone in shock. "I don't think we've met. I'm Colonel Reyes. Clare Dunmore," she said. Her voice was steadier now, though her eyes were still wet. "That's not the name I'm hearing whispered around this room," Reyes said carefully. "Someone said a moment ago you mentioned 14 years. These dogs, most of them were still active duty pups back then, deployed overseas. I'd guess you weren't working in this hospital 14 years ago." Claire shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "I wasn't. Where were you?" She was quiet for a long moment, one hand still resting against Atlas's massive head, feeling the old dog's breathing slow beneath her palm. "I was a combat medic," she said finally, "attached to a forward surgical unit. We treated wounded soldiers, and when there weren't enough veterinary personnel forward deployed, which was often, we treated wounded working dogs too. Nobody official ever really trained us for it. We just did it. Because somebody had to, and there wasn't always time to wait for someone qualified." The room had gone completely silent now, dozens of people straining to hear that had started as a whisper and had somehow become the only thing anyone in that hall cared about. "These 5 dogs," Reyes said slowly, looking around at Duke, Ranger, Coach, Nova, and Atlas, "came through your hands. Not all at the same time," Claire said, "over almost 2 years. Different units, different bases, different circumstances. Some of them came in wounded from IED strikes. Some came in after their handlers were killed, and nobody else could get near them for days." Atlas, her voice caught slightly on his name. "Atlas came in the worst. His handler died in the field, and by the time they brought him back to us, he hadn't eaten in 4 days and wouldn't let a single person touch him. Except at night, when it was quiet, when there was nobody around to perform for." "What did you do?" "I sat with him," Claire said simply. "Every night for almost 3 weeks, I sat on the floor of the recovery tent. A few feet away, not trying to touch him, just being there, until eventually he decided on his own that I wasn't a threat. And then eventually he decided I was something else." Atlas, as if he understood every word, pressed his head more firmly into her shoulder. "Why didn't you ever mention this?" Marissa Cole asked, still standing a few feet away, Ranger now lying calmly across her boots, as though the disruption had settled something in him too. "You've worked at this hospital for 3 years. Nobody knew any of this." Claire was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she did, her voice had a different quality to it, not evasive, exactly, but tired, in the specific way people get tired when they've spent a very long time managing the same private wait alone. When I came home, she said, I wasn't in a good place. Not for a long time. I'd lost 2 of the medics I served alongside. I'd watched more young men and women die than any 25-year-old should ever have to watch. And somewhere in the middle of all that, these dogs became the only thing that felt uncomplicated to me. They didn't ask me questions I couldn't answer. They didn't need me to explain what I'd seen. They just needed someone to sit with them. And I could do that, even on the nights I couldn't do much of anything else. She looked around at the 5 dogs now gathered around her, each one settled, each one calm in a way none of their handlers had ever quite seen them before. When I came home for good, she continued, I changed my focus, went into general medicine instead of anything combat adjacent. Changed my name back to my maiden name after my divorce, which meant most records under my old name didn't easily connect to who I am now. And I never talked about that part of my service, because every time I tried, people wanted it to be a war story, something dramatic, something with a clear beginning and end. But it was never that for me. It was 5 years of trying to keep as many living things alive as I could. And some nights, the only ones I could reach were the dogs, and I never expected any of them to remember me. I didn't think dogs kept people the way people keep people. Colonel Reyes, who had spent 4 decades around working dogs and had seen a great many things he couldn't fully explain, shook his head slowly. Ma'am, he said, with respect, I don't think you understand what you did for these animals. Working dogs bond to scent, to voice, to the specific chemistry of a person under stress, and they bond hardest during trauma, when everything else in their world has fallen apart. You didn't just treat their wounds. You were the one steady thing in the worst moment of each of their lives. Dogs don't forget that. Some of them spend years waiting for it. Claire's composure finally broke quietly. Without drama, just tears she made no effort to hide anymore, one hand resting on Atlas, the other on Duke. 5 retired war dogs settled around her in a loose, protective half-circle in the middle of a hospital event hall that had gone entirely, reverently silent in the hour that followed, the formal ceremony quietly abandoned, the chaplain setting aside his prepared remarks, the news crew filming without interrupting. Claire told the room, slowly and without embellishment, the story of each dog she had once treated. Duke, the graying German shepherd, had come to her field hospital as a 2-year-old with a shrapnel wound in his shoulder after his patrol vehicle struck a roadside device. His handler survived, badly wounded himself, and for 3 days, unable to be with his dog while both of them recovered separately. It had been Claire who changed Duke's bandages twice a day and slept, more nights than she could count, on a cot dragged next to his kennel so he wouldn't be alone in the dark. Ranger, the lean Malinois, had arrived nearly feral with fear after an ambush that killed 2 soldiers in his unit. He had bitten 2 other medics before anyone could examine him. Claire had spent 4 days simply sitting outside his kennel, reading aloud from whatever book she had on hand, until he finally allowed her close enough to treat the infection, spreading through a wound on his hind leg. Coach, the scarred Dutch shepherd, had lost part of his hearing in an explosion and struggled afterward with disorientation and panic in loud environments. Claire had learned, through weeks of trial and error, a specific sequence of hand signals that calmed him when sound couldn't reach him anymore. Signals, she realized only years later, watching old handler notes, that had become the basis for techniques still used with hearing-impaired working dogs today. Nova, the smallest and oldest female present, had come to Clare pregnant and malnourished after being separated from her unit during a chaotic evacuation and Clare had personally overseen the delivery of Nova's litter of 5 puppies in the back corner of a supply tent at 2 in the morning, with nothing but a headlamp and a medic's kit never designed for the job, and Atlas, whose story Clare told last, and slowest and with the most visible cost to herself, had been the dog whose handler died in the field, the one who wouldn't eat, wouldn't be touched, wouldn't do anything but wait through his 4 worst days for a person who was never coming back. Clare had been the one who finally reached him. And when her deployment ended 8 months later, she had been the one who had to say goodbye to him too, not knowing, not ever really believing, that he would remember her all these years later. "I used to wonder about all of you," she said quietly, looking around the circle of dogs. "I used to wonder if you made it, if you were okay. I never let myself hope I'd find out." Near the end of the gathering, as the crowd began, slowly and reluctantly, to disperse, a man in his late 30s approached the back wall, a man Clare didn't recognize, walking with the careful, deliberate gait of someone managing an old injury, dressed not in uniform but in civilian clothes, holding his phone loosely at his side. "Ma'am," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I hope it's all right, of course. My name is First Sergeant Daniel Ochoa. I was Atlas's original handler's closest friend in our unit, Sergeant Wyatt Price." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes. "Wyatt didn't make it home. You probably already know that part." Clare nodded, quiet. "What you might not know," Ochoa continued, "is that before Wyatt died, in one of his last letters home, he wrote about a medic who used to sit with Atlas at night. He never knew her name. She wasn't in his unit. She just showed up in the recovery tents wherever the wounded dogs were. He called her the quiet one. Said she never talked much, just sat there, steady, like she wasn't going anywhere. He said if anything ever happened to him, he hoped whoever that was would look after Atlas, because Atlas trusted her more than he trusted almost anyone." He held up his phone, showing Clare a photograph, a scanned, faded letter, handwriting slightly smudged with age. "His mother kept all his letters," Ochoa said. "She showed me this one after the funeral. I've carried a copy of it for years. I never thought I'd meet the woman he was talking about. I never thought anyone would." Clare read the letter slowly, her hand pressed against her mouth, Atlas's head still resting heavily against her side. "I didn't know he wrote that," she said, when she could speak again. "I didn't know he noticed me at all. I thought I was just background, someone passing through." "You weren't background," Ochoa said. "You were the last kindness that Dog had before he lost everything, and apparently, 14 years later, he still knows it." By the following week, the story had moved well beyond the walls of Fort Belwood Regional Medical Center. The local news segment, initially filmed as a light community interest piece about a K9 adoption event, had become something else entirely. A quiet, unscripted 7 minutes of 5 decorated military working dogs, recognizing, without prompting, without command, a woman who had once kept them alive in circumstances none of their current handlers had fully understood until that day. Clare didn't seek out the attention. If anything, she found it uncomfortable, the sudden visibility after 14 years of careful invisibility. But she didn't hide from it either. Not this time. She began visiting the K9 sanctuary regularly, at first just to see Atlas, and then, gradually, all 5 of them, spending her days off sitting in the same quiet, steady way she always had, letting 5 aging dogs remember, in their own time and their own way, that the woman who had once sat with them in the dark had finally come back. Colonel El Rey, moved by what he'd witnessed, quietly began compiling Clare's overseas service record, carefully, respectfully, with her permission, into a formal recommendation for recognition, the kind of quiet honor that rarely makes headlines but means everything to the people and animals it touches. You gave something to these dogs that nobody else could give them, he told her the week the paperwork was finalized. Not training, not commands, just presence, at the exact moment they needed it most. That's rarer than people think, and apparently, it's the kind of thing that doesn't fade. Not for them, and I suspect not for you either. Claire thought about that for a long moment, standing in the sanctuary's yard, watching Atlas doze in a patch of Texas sunlight, with his graying head resting against her knee. Duke and Ranger settled nearby, Coach and Nova close enough to touch. I used to think I left that part of my life behind, she said quietly. I thought I closed that door a long time ago. I didn't realize they never let it close on their end. She reached down and rested her hand against Atlas's head, the same gesture she had made 14 years earlier, in a different country, in a different uniform, when neither of them had known if either would survive the year. I'm not going anywhere this time, she told him, and for the first time since the day his handler died, Atlas exhaled, long and slow, and finally, completely, let himself rest. The nurse nobody had ever asked about had spent 14 years being invisible on purpose. It took 5 dogs, walking across a crowded room without a single command, to finally bring her home. If a dog or any animal has ever remembered you when you thought they never would, tell us their name in the comments below. We read every single one.